Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 8. Mine is the only class that will have a lecture and the midterm exam. That's because we had to do this hybrid class this week. Everyone must take their midterm exam this week and finish up by Friday. All right, the tests for all 4 classes will be open beginning today. So make sure that you take them and you hit submit so that your answers come to us, all right? There are no excuses for not taking the midterm. This is 40% of your grade, and we want you to do really well. Those people who are not in the hybrid class today can choose to watch this video later in the week or next week. It's okay. I am posting a homework assignment as well. The homework assignment is a very short reading assignment on the Harlem Renaissance. It's about a page long. Read it this week, but if you're too busy to do that, read it next week, just to give you some more background on the importance of the Harlem Renaissance. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, okay? The lecture is about the Harlem Renaissance, and it is about a time that changed the art of African Americans. And it took place here, right here in New York City, in Harlem, New York, in Manhattan. And what it did was, it was a time of prosperity at that time in the 1920s. And the Harlem Renaissance brought into focus the art, the artwork, music, fashion, culture, drama of African Americans into the world. And at that time, many affluent, many rich African Americans came to Harlem to settle. And it was also called the Great Migration from the Deep South. And the reason for that is that the Civil War had ended and Reconstruction had started, and slaves who are now freedmen are moving north, and they want to get away from the segregation and the racism that's taking place in the South. And they migrate to New York City, which is always a magnet for immigrants. And they specifically are ending up in Harlem. And some people say that it started like in the 19 teens, and it ended with the Great Depression. Well, technically it does. But the Harlem Renaissance was so strong that it's given birth to a continuation of African American art, okay? And this is something that people didn't realize for a while. And there were many rich whites that also came to Harlem to enjoy the great cultural aspects that were going on during this time. So again, the Harlem Renaissance starts with the Great Migration, African Americans leaving the Deep South after the Civil War and the Reconstruction era to escape persecution and racism and poverty. So they're coming here and they're starting to feel good about themselves. They want to express themselves. First, we're going to look at a video that's giving you an overview of the Harlem Renaissance, and then we'll talk about it a little bit more.
Throughout the 1920s, Harlem experienced a cultural and intellectual explosion that became known as the Harlem Renaissance. Who was involved in the Harlem Renaissance? What was the ultimate impact? Harlem is a neighborhood in New York City which has a very large African American community. Harlem became a destination for African Americans throughout the early 1900s as part of the Great Migration. As more blacks made Harlem their home, it increasingly became well known as an African American cultural center. Poets, writers, artists, musicians, and philosophers were all key parts of the movement. One of the key components of the Harlem Renaissance was music. Jazz performers, including Jelly Roll Morton, Fats Waller, Duke Ellington, and Louis Armstrong, perfected their music, which became very popular amongst white audiences. It was also during this era when the piano was incorporated into the jazz style of music. Traditionally, jazz bands had included primarily brass instruments. Intellectuals such as W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey argued and debated issues of racism, ethnic pride, and other topics related to African American life. Poets such as Langston Hughes introduced a new form of poetry known as jazz poetry. African American literature of the era included themes such as how slavery had impacted the African American culture and how to combat stereotypes of Black Americans. African American clothing also drastically changed during
This is
the Harlem
important.
Renaissance. Black men started wearing zoot suits. These were suits which featured long coats with padded shoulders and wide lapels. Women wore low-slung dresses, silk stockings, and open-toed slippers. Both genders wore hats with wide brims. Leopard skin items also became popular as they were seen as a connection to traditional African garb. The Harlem Renaissance had a profound impact on the United States, as well as the world. African American artists, musicians, and writers began to be respected on an international level. Not only were white audiences listening to and enjoying Black music, but white composers and musicians began incorporating African American rhythms and harmonies into their own pieces. The Harlem Renaissance also helped change the world's perception of African Americans. Prior to the 1920s, Blacks were thought of as uneducated farmers. However, thanks to the Harlem Renaissance, a new image of sophisticated and intellectual African Americans began to emerge.
Good afternoon, and welcome back to our Harlem Renaissance, a history of culture expression in the Black community. And that is the title of our lecture series today. This is the third of our.
Okay, hold on, I'm just trying to get this to stop. Okay. I think I got it now. So you can see how important the Harlem Renaissance was to African Americans in the United States. That brief video clip showed you that most people, most white people in the United States viewed African Americans as farmers and uneducated. The start of the African American movement that created Harlem Renaissance began to educate people to see African Americans in a different light. So it started in the late 1910s, and the playwrights and authors have all played a great part in it. And the artwork that we saw during the video displayed the jazz, displayed the urban life of African Americans in Harlem. And if you looked at it, some of it was almost a caricature of some of the people in there, sort of big white eyes and big smiles. And sometimes these artists were criticized for that. People said that shouldn't be the way that African Americans were depicted. Others believe that it showed joy in the art, it showed movement. And when you look at certain artwork throughout this lecture, you will see movement through the shapes and the colors that the artists use. They're using bright colors, and many of them will use sort of a geometric form. You'll see sort of triangles for lapels and rectangular shaped bodies. And that comes a little bit from Cubism, which the famous artist Picasso used. So they pick up from a number of different inspirations in their art. So what really was the Harlem Renaissance? It was a time for pride for African Americans. It was a time for freedom and expression. And it was a time where these people who had been oppressed for quite some time could start to celebrate their culture and bring others into it. And that was very successful because many, as I said earlier, and the clip said, white people came to enjoy the culture and the food and the theater and the artwork. And it also spread into the entertainment business, mixing both the music of the Renaissance, the jazz music that incorporated pianos as well as brass and wind instruments, with traditional entertainment that white people would have been viewing. So it was starting a bridge between two cultural groups. So I want you to look at this video that I have here and take a look again about the photographs that we're going to look at and just see what kind of feeling you get from the artwork and what kind of story this artwork from the Harlem Renaissance is showing you.
Good afternoon, and welcome back to our Harlem Renaissance, a history of culture expression in the Black community. And that is the title of our lecture series today. This is the third of our lecture series that are brought to you by the Diversity and Inclusion Committee here at North Shore. And today's presentation will be given by Ms. Natasha Flores, who is the coordinator for the Reconnect and Success program and teaches Western civilization. And she's also the champion in the hula hoop competition at CPS. So we're really thrilled to have her here with us today. Without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Natasha, and we look forward to hearing how the Harlem Renaissance has influenced the culture in the Black community. Natasha.
All right, we're only going to watch part of this video because it's very long.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm excited to be here today to discuss the Harlem Renaissance, which was a cultural movement during the early 20th century. So you're probably wondering, what is the Harlem Renaissance? It might be a term that you've heard coined before, maybe certain passing in literature classes, or possibly even in your history course. So the Harlem Renaissance was a literary and art movement that served There we go. All right.
So look at the colors in this.
I don't have some kind of second.
Look at the movement with the
What
lines.
was the Harlem Renaissance? Well, the Harlem Renaissance was a literary and art movement that served as a platform for African Americans to shed light on their experiences. And we'll discuss a little bit more how that came to be and why that was important and influential, especially for the time. The Harlem Renaissance, it was on top of being a literary and art movement, it was also tied into social, political, as well as artistic movements of the time. So it was connected to important figures like W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey, which you'll hear their names again as we go. It was also a celebration of Black artists as well as literature. And we will hear throughout the reference to the term Negro at the time within their writings to take back control of Black identity and language. So you're going to hear that just as some of our terminology as we go as part of the movement. However, in order to understand the significance of the Harlem
Harlem Renaissance and understand how it came about, we need to talk about the background, right? We need to set up the stage for the Harlem Renaissance. So bear with me as we go. We're gonna cover a little bit of history here. So to understand how this movement evolved, we must first take a look at the background of this time. In the turn of the century America, social unrest often erupted in violence, as to say. Reactions to World War I at the time led to something called the First Red Scare, and it created a climate of fear and nativism. And this was surrounded by many Americans, their fear and their alarm at the rise of immigration coming out of World War I. There's a massive rise of immigration into America, and with their fears surrounded was the possibility of the spread of communism in the United States, as well as a threat to the workforce at the time. So why am I telling you this? Well, the social unrest is going to lead to a wave of violence, and it's going to, we're going to see a great migration as African Americans are moving into the North and creating their own communities. So one such reaction to this time period would be the reemergence of radical white supremacy groups such as the Ku Klux Klan. Racial violence would rise between the years 1880 and 1930, especially in areas of the Jim Crow South. In an effort to fight social tensions and gain civil rights for African Americans, we'll see activist political organizations emerge, such as the NAACP, which is the National Advancement for the Association of Colored People, led by W.E.B. Du Bois, and the UNIA, which is the Universal Negro Improvement Association, led by Marcus Garvey. So these two guys, although they are very important and influential figures in the fight for civil rights at the time, they're going to have different ideas and identities on how to do that. And we're going to see a lot of this influence tied into the Harlem Renaissance as well. So the Harlem Renaissance will play a backdrop to these different opinions on what was the best approach to better the lives of the African American community. It will appear in literary writings at the time. It will appear in pamphlets. There will be specific art that is attached to pamphlets coming out by the NAACP. So starting during World War I, African Americans will seek new opportunities in the North, which means many of them are leaving the rural South, that Jim Crow rural South. They're going to go in droves, large groups, mass migration. It's something we call, as historians, we call this mass movement the Great Migration. And as a result, it will lead to the creation of Black communities and culture within large cities like Chicago, St. Louis, and New York, which will be our prime focus in the Manhattan district of Harlem, which this movement gets its name from. There we go. So if you look at this slide, the first wave of the Great Migration, this is actually the name of this piece by artist Jacob Lawrence. He celebrated the mass movement of African Americans north into the cities in this migration series. This series actually comprised of about 60 panels. This is the first one. It's very famous in regards to the Harlem Renaissance because it shows kind of a backdrop of hope as the colors and the mass movement is showing like a background of hope going into this new start north. However, we will see that it will not, if you ever decide to look at other panels in the Great Migration series, you'll notice that it doesn't stay hopeful. We see, times become difficult. It invokes a lot of the problems that the Black community is going to face in the movement north, some of which will be the issue of segregation. Many of the African Americans moving from the South in the Great Migration up north, they're going to settle in areas that were traditionally White communities, and they'll face a wave of backlash from neighbors. We'll see kind of considered white flight out of these neighborhoods into other areas. There will be a backlash backlash, of course, as I mentioned, from the Klan, who is going to have one of the largest settlements in Indiana, one of the northern states. They're going to have one of the largest gatherings. So that brings us to Harlem, which it was named after. Not all participants who were part of this movement lived in the city of Harlem, New York. However, it was a symbolic place of awakening for this movement. A lot of the writers we're going to talk about focused their writings within Harlem and that community. Harlem is a prime example of a Black community settled within an area that's traditionally white Manhattan. So as many of these migrants are moving from the South and the West and into these very prosperous industrial cities to settle, we're going to see there were areas that were open, tenements open that needed people to settle in, and landlords were encouraging, come on in, settle here, and eventually it would take over as this thriving hub of Black culture within the nightlife of the city of Harlem.
Okay, so you can see how this discrimination and this racism against African Americans in the United States caused this great migration. And they moved up into areas like Chicago, St. Louis, but many, many more to New York, to Manhattan, to the area of Harlem where they settled. And as we just heard, one of the reasons why it was a good place to settle were there were tenements in some areas that needed to be occupied, and landlords wanted to make money, so they invited people to come and stay there. One of the most famous artists of the Harlem Renaissance is Aaron Davis. And his work was referred to as art that used biblical imagery and spiritual inspiration, meaning he was thinking about his religious beliefs and putting those things into his artwork. And, you know, we've seen so much artwork over the past few weeks where we've seen religious thought and religious beliefs being depicted in the artwork. Remember with the Aboriginal art, the early American art, the indigenous people who were doing totem poles, the gravestone art where they were depicting the death symbol of a skeleton flanked by angel wings to help the body or the soul go up to heaven. We saw a lot of things that reflected different kinds of religious beliefs. And that's true with art many, many times. So here we're looking at African Americans who are looking to escape the stereotypical thought of what they were, who they were, to get a new start on life, okay? And it was believed that the creation of this art and literature would serve to uplift the race. So what does that mean? Uplift the race. It means several things. It means, number one, that it will bring into focus who and what African Americans really were or are. It will also help those very same people who were oppressed during the Civil War and the Reconstruction era in the United States. And I know that in your American history class, you've covered this already because I saw your midterm. So you're familiar with that. How they were treated during the Civil War and the Reconstructive era and how they're going to escape that now. So it was uplifting them. So one of the people who is also influential is a woman whose name is Nita Warwick Fuller. And she was an African-American woman sculptor. And she was a protege. She was a student of the very famous Auguste Rodin, who also is known for that statue where we see the guy is sitting and he's sitting like this, and it's called The Thinker. he's famous for that. He's done many, many other things, but she studied with him. And she also did theater and she did some painting. And she was known for being a well-known sculptor in Paris as well. And after that, she came to the United States. And she used to use like a horror-based, like a scary kind of style. And she also started to show the racial injustice that was faced by African Americans throughout her art. Some of them even showed lynchings, the hangings of African Americans, because she was using her art to depict the history of her people. Okay, so let me see if I can get that for us.
Nita Warwick Fuller was really an important artist at a time where not many African American sculptors were telling their own stories. Nita's work is passionate, it's daring. (1899), Paris, France. 22-year-old Nita Warwick Fuller arrived alone from the U.S. to attend art school. She was restricted from access in the U.S. from predominantly all-white academies. This is why she goes to Paris. There are not a lot of African-American women who are doing this in the late 19th, early 20th century. It's arranged that she will go to the American Girls Pub to find residence there. But she's denied the minute she shows up at the door. The director said, "You didn't tell me that you were not a white girl." I said, "I was told that the club was here for American girls who came to Paris to study, and I felt that I, as an American girl, was entitled to come."
So you see the racism on that.
Warwick found her own apartment and enrolled in art school. Nita was shocked to encounter American-style racism in Paris, but that defining moment forced her to become independent, to become more fully an artist. Nita Warwick Fuller was born in 1877 to a middle-class family in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Her father owned his own barber shop, and her mother was a hairdresser. And they were able to provide her with activities that were fairly unusual for most Black kids growing up in the United States, for music and dance classes, art making classes. My father and I went to art exhibitions, and together we lived in the pictures we saw, and the sculptures overwhelmed us. Fuller was very interested in work that conveyed deep emotion and kind of the psychological interior. Particularly as a teenager, she was interested in ghost stories and tales of horror. This was the food upon which my imagination thrived. Warwick Fuller was studying in Paris when a World's Fair opened in 1900. World fairs were places that African Americans felt they could set their record straight about their education, their contributions to literature, to the arts, to music. The organizers of the American Negro exhibit, including noted scholar W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the founders of the NAACP, invited Warwick Fuller to create displays celebrating Black history. She starts out as a young artist, and right away she makes this important connection with W.E.B. Du Bois. He becomes someone who will promote her career. They assembled dioramas that were scenes of Black life and statistical information to prove the advancement of the Black race. In Paris, Warwick Fuller also met leading sculptor Auguste Rodin. He takes her around his studios. She sees his plaster casts of body parts, and she is floored by this experience. He is downright influential on her work. That interest in the interior life, but also in the artist's hand being present in the materials, is something she fully understands from Rodin. Rodin is a master of them all. My heart went out, and with clenched fists, I determined to fulfill my promise. Warwick Fuller's work was shown in 3 major exhibitions in Paris, including one at the Students' Club, which rejected her 3 years prior. She is the only American sculptor that is called out in the French press for her kind of amazing work. And she's called the sculptor of horrors because she is creating small scale objects that show the deepest kind of darkest emotions that we can have.
My work is of the soul rather than the figure, and sometimes the figure must be very crude in order to carry the full strength of the spiritual meaning.
She's able to convey so much emotion and power in these figures simply by turn of the head or a tilt of the hip. She's a real incredible and unique talent in that respect. My name's Alison Sarr, and I'm an artist. I really enjoy a transformation of materials. A huge part of sculpture is actually physically being able to experience it through touch. When I was growing up, it was pretty few and far in between that we could see an exhibition of an artist of color, and more so featuring women artists. Being a sculptor and working with things like chainsaws and rusty tin definitely wouldn't have been considered ladylike then. Sculpture has always been a man's world. All the schools I went to, all the sculpture teachers were male. It was very macho. So it was a difficult trail to pursue.
Warwick Fuller returned to Philadelphia. Despite her success abroad, she was ostracized from the white male-dominated art scene. Once she walked into that gallery space as a Black woman, the racism just was enacted almost immediately. There were many disappointments when I tried to sell work, but I resolved to work at all odds and continue to create. In 1907, Warwick Fuller became the first African-American woman to receive a federal art commission when Du Bois invited her to mark the 300th anniversary of the Jamestown, Virginia settlement. It was a very complicated situation. African-Americans were not allowed to attend during regular hours. There would be what were called Negro days. But she showed at this fair and won a prize for these dioramas about progress. She's not stereotyping. She's not resorting to those early 20th century images of the mammy or Uncle Tom. She's trying to offer an alternative vision about Blackness. I was anxious to do the work because I loved it and because it was an opening for me. She met Solomon Carter Fuller, the first person of African descent to practice psychiatry in the U.S. They married in 1909, set up a home in Framingham, Massachusetts, and had 3 sons. Her husband wanted her to be a mother and a wife first. He was not interested in her pursuing her art career full time. She had to carve out a space in her attic where she continued to create. Warwick Fuller later secretly built herself a studio near their home. In 1910, a fire broke out in the warehouse where she stored her work. 16 years of her art was destroyed. Most of her work from Paris does not remain because it was destroyed in this fire. She must have been just a heartsore at the loss of this collection. This morning, I got a feeling so blue. It is awful to feel you have power you cannot make use of. In 1913, Fuller was commissioned to create a sculpture for the 50th anniversary of the abolishment of slavery. She creates a statue of 2 figures, a man and a woman. They are semi-nude, and they are not being liberated by Abraham Lincoln or a former owner. They're self-liberating. She was radical during her time period for taking up the Black body in sculpture.
My monument for Harriet Tubman in Harlem, probably the most prominent. I have embedded in her skirt various objects that would belong to passengers of the Underground Railroad, what few things you could actually carry while trying to escape slavery. And then coming out of the back of her skirt are these roots, which symbolize her role in uprooting slavery. I'm really interested in the
Okay, so again, we see a woman who is trying to depict African Americans as human beings with rights, with an education, And she meets with a lot of opposition, but she does not give up. So this movement of the Harlem Renaissance does give hope to these artists and performers and writers so that they can express themselves. It was very difficult, and it had personal meaning to many of them. They would think about their ancestors, their mothers, their fathers, their grandparents, and also what they had gone through to get them to where they were today. And they talked about segregation. Segregation is the separation of people by race. And they talked about the exhibit where she did these panoramas, these displays that depicted African-American life. However, the irony or the strangeness of this was that while it depicted African-American life, African-Americans were not free to come and view this artwork. They had certain times in the evening or certain days called Negro Days, which was the term that was used at that time, where they were able to come in and view this artwork. So that was very ironic in that she's showing us African-American life as it really is, but the people who it depicts are not allowed to go in. So again, this is a form of racism, a form of segregation that's still happening during this movement in the United States. And she experienced it when she went to Paris. When she went to Paris, she went to study because, as we saw in the past with other women artists, women were not allowed for a good long time to study with men in art studios. And remember, they weren't even allowed to use live models when women were there. That was very against the rules. So when she goes to France, she's hoping to be able to be in a class with men and women, and also to get all of the training that she needs. So what does she do? She books a place where young women would stay. They've accepted her deposit, they've accepted her. And when she gets to the residence that she's going to stay in, they say, "You can't stay here." She says, "Why not?" And they said, "Because you're not white." And she said, "But you said it was a residence for American women artists, and that's what I am." So she had to go out and find her own residence, her own apartment where she could live during this time. The next person that I want to expose you to is a photographer from this time, a photographer who was passionate and active during the Harlem Renaissance. And his name was James Van Der Zee, and his photography captured Harlem's daily life. So do you remember when we talked about the ashcan art and how ashcan art depicted daily life? Poor people, not just rich people, street cleaners, people standing outside smoking a cigarette, clothes hanging on a line, that sort of thing. Well, when James Van Der Zee decided to do his photography during the Harlem Renaissance, he chose those types of subjects, just like we saw when we saw the ashcan art. What does that do? What did ashcan art do? It brought into focus the everyday, non-rich people of that time, where they lived, how they lived, what they enjoyed, what they endured, okay? So James Van Der Zee was a photographer during that time who showed his artwork and who showed his photography as people lived and as they were, okay? Then the next person I'd like to tell you a little bit about, we saw one picture already, was the artist and painter named Jacob Lawrence. Jacob Lawrence was a painter during the Harlem Renaissance who portrayed African American historical subjects and contemporary life. He used Cubism. Remember, I talked about that a little earlier, geometric shapes like we would see in the artwork of Picasso. Jacob Lawrence used cubism in his art, and he used colors, bright colors to depict life in Harlem. He's best at knowing how to illustrate or how to show the African American experience in Harlem, African American life in Harlem. And that's what his drive was, to show what lives were like during that time. And he shows the lifestyles that were created by the Great American Migration and also up until the Depression. And they talk about the Depression in the United States as being the culmination, the ending of Harlem Renaissance. Things in art movements don't end immediately, they do go on. But the Depression was a really hard time in the United States where people lost their jobs, the banks failed, there was people went hungry, there was no food, there were no places to live. It was a very hard time. And when that struck in the United States, it also struck throughout the world and had an impact on art. Just like when we started this lecture, you heard in one of the first videos that World War I was jumping point for different forms of art. And we've talked about that in the past. World War I left people very bitter. And from that bitterness, different types of artwork came up. And that was also a time where the Renaissance was developing. Okay, so let's see if I have something for you.
My name is Paul Priestley. Welcome to Art History School, the home of art history for everybody. Today we're going to look at the American artist, Jacob Lawrence, one of the most widely acclaimed American artists of the 20th century, best known for illustrating the African American experience and history in the United States. Jacob Armstead Lawrence was born in Atlantic City, USA on the 7th of September 1917. His parents were Jacob, a railway cook, and Rosa Lee. In 1990, his father moved the family to Easton, Pennsylvania, hoping to find work as a coal miner. His sister Geraldine was born that year too. Lawrence's parents separated in 1924, and his mother took the children to Philadelphia, where his brother William was born. Later, in 1927, his mother moved to New York City to look for work. And for the next 3 years, Lawrence and his siblings were left in foster homes in Philadelphia. In 1930, his mother united the family and moved to 142 West Street in Harlem, New York. During the 1930s, the depression was acute. Lawrence's mother lost her job and the family had to go on welfare. Lawrence was enrolled in Public School 89 in Harlem and at the Utopia Children's Center that provided after-school programs in arts and crafts. The center was run by the painter Charles Alston, who soon recognized young Lawrence's talents. In 1932, Lawrence attended the High School of Commerce for 2 years, whilst continuing to study with Charles Alston at the Harlem Art Workshop. It was here that he met Gwendolyn Knight, who would later become his wife. Lawrence's mother had hoped her son might become a postman, but Lawrence had other ideas. Having regularly visited the Metropolitan Museum of Art with Gwendolyn, he was fascinated by early Italian Renaissance masters such as Giotto and Duccio, and so decided to drop out of art high school. Success came very early. In 1935, at the age of 18, Lawrence had his first exhibition with a 306 group show at the Alston Barnum studio in Harlem. He was renting a small space in the corner of Alston's studio at the time and did so until 1940. His early paintings depict his environment his studio, street scenes of his neighborhood, and everyday life in Harlem, using commercial paint on lightweight brown paper. Lawrence became the first major artist of the 20th century to be technically trained and artistically educated within the art community in Harlem. Lawrence had his first solo exhibition in 1936 and also met Charles Seifert, a lecturer and historian who inspired him to focus on the historical narrative and struggle of African Americans. He began his researches at Harlem branch of the New York Public Library, now the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. During the same year, he saw Du Bois' play Haiti at the Lafayette Theatre in Harlem. Suddenly, Haiti became a focus, and in particular, the life of Toussaint Louverture, a Black revolutionary general and founder of the Republic of Haiti. Lawrence felt a single painting would not do justice to Louverture's numerous achievements. So he produced a series of 41 panels in total. In 1937, with the assistance of the artist Harry Gottlieb, Lawrence obtained a 2-year scholarship to the American Artists School in New York, where he studied with Eugene Morley, Philip Reisman, and Saul Wilson.
Okay, so you can see through his paintings and his works that he depicts slavery and he depicts what African Americans went through, their struggles. And they talked a little bit about Archibald Motley Jr. And he was a visual artist during that time, within the Harlem Renaissance. And he went to the Art Institute of Chicago during 1910, and he too worked on depicting or showing the Black urban American strife, the hard times that African Americans were experiencing. And he would show colorful street scenes and portraits of African Americans during that time. So what I want you to look at the jazz and rhythms that you see in this video. It's a short clip of Archibald Motley Jr. and see how, and compare it in your mind to what you just saw, to compare it to what you just saw of Jacob Lawrence.
So here we are at our fantastic Archibald Motley painting, self-portrait, a painting you know and love very well. Indeed, it really is a celebration of Motley upon his graduation from the School of the Art Institute, one of the very few African-American students at this time. He wants to ensure that everyone understands that he's a professional artist. He takes himself quite seriously and expects us to look at him this way.
Painter Archibald Motley Jr. was the most acclaimed Chicago-based African-American artist of his generation. Writer and activist W.E.B. Du Bois praised him as a credit to his race. Motley's fame came early, and he was able to study art in Paris for a Guggenheim Fellowship. The tenacious artist applied for the grant twice.
As Genesis turned down, 1928, I had my exhibition at Plattsburgh again.
What type of things did you paint when you were in France?
Oh, I painted blue.
There's not an inch of space that isn't being used, all these interlocking forms. Motley had the opportunity to study the old masters and really look at composition.
The first thing in composition was knowing the breaking up of space. And get into more things that complicated to get into color.
Motley was really interested in thinking about questions of race. And then what we're seeing here are not actually white women, but rather light-skinned African women.
I was introduced to Motley by Margaret Burroughs. He and I would sit there and talk. He loved to drink, he loved to laugh, but my buddy was color struck, meaning that he privileged the lighter skinned people.
Motley did not live in Chicago's Black community known as Bronx. His family lived in the mostly white neighborhood of Inglewood. His mother was especially proud of being of mixed race, and Motley's wife was German American.
We were the only color family living within a radius of about 3 miles. In order to study them, I made the habit to go to places where they gathered, like churches, movie house, dance hall, sporting houses.
One of the things about a tightly racially segregated city is that all elements of the community are crowded into a narrow space.
So now we're here at Nightlight, which is just such an amazing, dramatic, dynamic, colorful painting. You have different kind of vignettes and scenes happening too. You have the interactions here between this couple, but then likewise you kind of wonder what is being explained between this man and this woman over here. You've got the loner over here in the background.
Every picture should tell a story. I think if a picture doesn't tell a story, then it's not a picture.
The difficulty comes in the editorial attitude.
Again, you could see the use of the colors, the movement, the shapes. So that was reflected in all of the art during this time. So this was the Harlem Renaissance in conclusion was an intellectual art movement shown through illustrations, paintings, sculpture, photography, music, all of the above. And Harlem became the spiritual center for African Americans at that time. So I hope you enjoyed this lecture on the Harlem Renaissance, and we're excited about it because it took place very close to where we're living. And again, make sure that you take your midterm exam in all of your classes and submit it. And I look forward to seeing everyone again. And thank you over there at NIAC for all of your help. And I'll see you next week.